December 11th, 1936, Fort Belvedere, Windsor, Great Park. Late afternoon, as winter darkness fell across England, King Edward VIII, sovereign of the United Kingdom and the Dominions, Emperor of India, sat alone in his study. Outside, crowds gathered in the cold. Inside, the King of England prepared to give up his throne, not for political crisis, not for scandal of his own making, not for illness or incapacity, but for an American woman, a twice-divorced American woman who would never be accepted as his queen. Wallis Warfield Spencer Simpson, born into respectable poverty in Baltimore, married twice before. Sharp-tongued, elegant, impossibly thin, a woman who inspired either devotion or revulsion, rarely indifference. She didn't set out to bring down a king, but she would become the only American woman whose existence forced a British monarch to choose between crown and heart. This is the story of Wallis Simpson, whose calculated climb through society ended in the most spectacular exile of the 20th century. From 1896 to 1986, Wallis's life reveals the price of ambition, the trap of royal obsession, and the bitter irony of getting exactly what you thought you wanted, only to discover it was a prison sentence. Born June 19th in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, Wallis would become the woman blamed for the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history. But behind the accusations and the exile lay a more complex truth. A woman raised to marry well in a society that offered women few other paths. Yet a woman whose wit and style captivated a weak man who happened to wear a crown. A woman who found herself caught in forces far beyond her control, vilified by an empire, and trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. This is a story about ambition and its consequences, about the difference between wanting to be queen and actually understanding what that means, about how one woman's determination to secure her future led to a lifetime of exile, surveillance, and profound loneliness. But most importantly, it's about the terrible price of being loved by the wrong person in the wrong way at the wrong time. To understand Wallis Simpson's story, we must understand the world she was born into, late Victorian America, where women's options were marriage or poverty, and marrying well was not just desirable, but essential for survival. 1900. The new century arrived with rigid social hierarchies. The 400 ruled New York society. Old money looked down on new. North looked down on South, still recovering from the Civil War. And women, regardless of class, had one job: find a husband who could support them. Into this world, on June 19th, 1896, Bessie Wallis Warfield was born, not in Baltimore as she later claimed, seeking respectability, but in a resort cottage in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, where her mother had retreated in the final months of pregnancy. Her parents, Teakle Wallis Warfield and Alice Montague, were not married long before tragedy struck. Teakle, sickly with tuberculosis, died when Wallis was only 5 months old. His death left Alice and baby Wallis dependent on the grudging charity of the Warfield family, and Baltimore's fading aristocracy, with money enough to be comfortable, but not enough to be generous. Uncle Solomon Warfield, the family patriarch, controlled the purse strings. A bachelor who ran the Continental Trust Company, he dispensed just enough money to his brother's widow to keep her from actual poverty, but not enough to free her from dependence. Alice and Wallis moved between modest apartments and relatives' homes, always conscious of their diminished status, always aware they lived on sufferance. Young Wallis learned early what it meant to be poor among the prosperous, to be tolerated, but not truly belonging. The pretty dresses came second-hand. The birthday parties happened in borrowed spaces. The social invitations arrived because of her name, not her circumstances. She watched wealthier girls whose fathers had lived. She had girls who didn't need to wear hand-me-downs, and she learned a lesson she would never forget. Security came only through advantageous marriage. Her childhood home was a modest apartment on East Biddle Street in Baltimore. Small rooms, second-hand furniture, the smell of her mother's careful economies, stretching every dollar Uncle Solomon grudgingly provided. Wallis shared a bedroom with her mother, heard through thin walls when Alice cried over bills, felt the shame of genteel poverty, that was perhaps worse than ordinary poverty, because it required maintaining appearances with nothing behind the facade. But if Wallis lacked money, she possessed something else: intelligence, sharp wit, an ability to read people and situations. And as she grew, she had a certain style that had nothing to do with expensive clothes and everything to do with how she carried herself. Thin to the point of severity, she would never be conventionally beautiful, but she learned how to use what she had, how to make her presence felt in a room, how to make men feel important when she spoke to them. She attended Oldfields School, a proper finishing school for young ladies, though how the tuition was paid remained a source of family tension. There she learned what all young women of her class learned: how to sit, how to speak, how to enter a room, how to charm, how to be exactly the kind of wife an ambitious man would want. 1916. At 20, Wallis experienced her first taste of independence when she visited her cousin Corinne in Pensacola, Florida. The Naval Air Station buzzed with young officers, had men in uniform, men with futures. Among them was Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a handsome pilot with charm and ambition and a growing drinking problem that Wallis either didn't notice or chose to ignore. They married on November 8, 1916. Wallis wore a white dress, carried white orchids, and believed she had secured her future. Mrs. Earl Winfield Spencer, a naval officer's wife, respectable, safe. The marriage was a disaster almost from the start. Win Spencer drank, not socially, not occasionally, but constantly, desperately. He grew violent when drunk, jealous when sober. They moved from posting to posting: San Diego, Washington, China. Each location brought the same pattern: evenings that started with promise and ended with Win drunk, Wallis frightened or furious, neighbors pretending not to hear the fights through thin walls. By 1924, 8 years into a miserable marriage, Wallis found herself in China, far from home, stuck with an alcoholic husband in foreign postings where American naval wives formed their own insular society. She began to understand that marriage for security was only secure if the husband stayed employed, stayed sober, stayed alive. Win Spencer was failing on all counts. She left him, not yet divorced. The stigma was too great, but separated. She traveled. Shanghai, where she stayed with friends and reportedly had an affair with an Italian diplomat, though the details remain unclear. Peking, where she rented a small house and lived on an allowance from Uncle Solomon, who disapproved of separation but disapproved more of the scandal of divorce. But by 1927, Wallis had made her decision. Better one divorce than a lifetime of misery. The divorce from Win Spencer was finalized, leaving her 31 years old, divorced, and dependent once again on family charity. She needed another marriage. Quickly. A woman of 31 with one failed marriage behind her had limited options and little time. She returned to the United States, moved between friends' apartments, and began the careful work of finding her next husband. Ernest Simpson appeared like an answer to prayer. British by citizenship, American by birth, he worked in the shipping business his family owned. Solid, prosperous, respectable, and currently married, but rumoured to be unhappily so. Wallis, with the calculation born of necessity, set her sights on him. They married on July 21st, 1928, at the Chelsea Register Office in London. Wallis was 32. Ernest was 32. His divorce from his first wife had been finalised mere weeks before. It was a practical arrangement. Ernest needed a hostess for his business entertaining. Wallis needed security. They provided each other with what the other required. London in the late 1920s offered Wallis something she had never truly had: stability, a comfortable flat at 5 Bryanston Court, enough money for clothes and entertaining, a husband who didn't drink himself into violence and who appreciated her skills as a hostess. She learned to navigate London society, that peculiar mix of aristocracy and bourgeoisie, where Americans with sufficient money and style could sometimes, with persistence, gain entry to circles that would have been closed in more rigid Boston or New York. Ernest's business connections brought them into social circles just below the truly elite. Dinner parties with other shipping merchants, weekends at country houses owned by minor aristocracy, always on the edges, never quite at the center, but closer than a twice-married American woman from Baltimore had any reason to expect. 1930. Wallis was 34. Her life had achieved a certain equilibrium, not excitement, but comfort, not passion, but security. She entertained twice weekly at Bryanston Court. She hired French chefs for important dinners. She wore the best clothes her budget would allow and supplemented with excellent jewelry, real when possible, very good fake when necessary. Then, in January 1931, through mutual friends, Thelma Furness and her husband Wallis Simpson met the Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales, Edward, David to his friends, heir to the British throne, 40 years old, unmarried, and showing no inclination to find a suitable bride despite his family's increasing desperation. Golden-haired, slight of build, boyishly charming, and utterly captivated by the sophisticated American women who treated him not as a royal prince, but as an ordinary man. The meeting was unremarkable. A party, introductions, polite conversation. The prince was involved with Thelma Furness, the beautiful American-born twin sister of Gloria Vanderbilt. Wallis was safely married to Ernest. Nothing suggested this meeting would change the British monarchy, but over the next 2 years, a pattern emerged. Wallis and Ernest were increasingly invited to weekend parties where the prince was present. Fort Belvedere, the prince's private retreat in Windsor Great Park. Wallis discovered she could make the prince laugh. Her sharp American wit, so different from the deferential courtesy he received from British subjects, delighted him. She teased him. She contradicted him. She treated him like an ordinary man, and he, who had never been treated as ordinary in his life, found this intoxicating. 1934. Thelma Furness made a fatal mistake. She travelled to America for several weeks, and before leaving, she asked Wallis to look after the prince while she was gone. It was meant as a joke, a casual request, but when Thelma returned, everything had changed. The prince was no longer interested in Thelma. He was obsessed with Wallis. Wallis Simpson was 38 years old, twice married, not beautiful in any conventional sense, her face too angular, her frame too thin, but she possessed something the Prince of Wales needed desperately, the ability to dominate him, to tell him what to do, to organize his life. The prince, despite his position, was weak, indecisive, needy. He required someone strong to lean on, and his father, King George V, and his mother, Queen Mary, had never provided emotional support, only cold duty. The affair began in earnest in 1934. The prince showered Wallis with gifts, jewelry, clothes, vacation. He bought her whatever she wanted. He rearranged his schedule around her. He called her constantly when they were apart. He needed her, in the desperate, clingy way of weak men who find a strong woman to tell them what to do. Ernest Simpson, Wallis's husband, watched this unfold with the helplessness of a man who understands he is being displaced by royalty and has no recourse. What could he do? Forbid his wife from seeing the Prince of Wales? He tried gentle suggestions. He tried ignoring it. He tried accompanying her to every royal event. Nothing worked. The prince wanted Wallis, and what the prince wanted, he pursued with single-minded obsession. By 1935, all of London society knew the Prince of Wales was besotted with Mrs. Simpson. The British press, operating under a gentleman's agreement not to publish details of royal private lives, remained silent. But American newspapers, bound by no such agreements, reported every detail: the prince's obsession, the jewels, the vacations, the married American woman who had somehow captivated the heir to the British throne. Wallis found herself in an impossible position. She was 40 years old, still married to Ernest, though the marriage existed now only on paper. The prince's obsession was flattering but also frightening in its intensity. He spoke of marriage. He spoke of making her his queen. Wallis, who understood British society far better than the prince seemed to, knew this was impossible. The Church of England did not recognize divorce. The Prince of Wales, as future head of that church, could not marry a divorced woman, certainly not a twice-divorced American woman, but the prince refused to hear reason. He wanted Wallis, therefore he would have Wallis. The details, he insisted, would somehow work themselves out. January 20th, 1936, King George V died at Sandringham. His son became King Edward VIII, and the constitutional crisis that had been building for 2 years suddenly became urgent. The new king was 41 years old. Protocol demanded he marry and produce an heir, but Edward wanted only Wallis. He wanted to make her his queen. He began pressing his advisors. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, listened with growing horror. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, warned of catastrophe. The king's own mother, now the Queen Mother, made her position brutally clear. Wallis Simpson was unacceptable. Spring and summer of 1936 passed in increasing tension. Wallis moved through a world transformed into nightmare. She was still Mrs. Ernest Simpson, but everyone knew Ernest had been displaced. And she was not yet free to marry the king, but everyone assumed she would divorce Ernest. She was trapped between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. The king paraded her publicly. A Mediterranean cruise on the yacht Narlin, photographs splashed across European newspapers. Wallis, in a bathing suit, relaxing with the King of England. Back in Britain, where press silence still held, the public remained largely unaware. But among the elite, the aristocracy, the government, panic grew. This could not stand. The king must marry appropriately or give up his obsession. But Edward refused to budge. Wallis or abdication. Those were the only options he would consider. Wallis filed for divorce from Ernest Simpson in October 1936. The decree would become final in April 1937. The king made his intentions clear. The moment Wallis was free, he would marry her. The government could accept it or be damned. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, tried everything: reason, appeals to duty, warnings about constitutional crisis. Nothing worked. The king would not give up Wallis. Baldwin presented 3 options: marry Wallis and provoke a constitutional crisis that could bring down the monarchy, marry her morganatically, meaning she would be his wife but not queen, a solution that required parliamentary approval which would never come, or abdicate. November moved into December. Behind closed doors, negotiations grew desperate. The king's brothers, particularly the Duke of York, who would become king if Edward abdicated, pleaded with him. The king's staff drafted abdication papers just in case, and Wallis, at the centre of the storm, began to understand the catastrophe she had unwittingly caused. She fled to France, to friends, trying to escape the pressure, but the king called her constantly, crying, begging, threatening suicide if she left him. She was trapped. If she abandoned him now, she would be blamed for breaking his heart. If she stayed with him, she would be blamed for destroying the monarchy. There was no position she could take that would not result in her vilification. December 1st, 1936, the British press finally broke its silence. King's marriage, the headlines screamed. The secret was out. The British public, who had known nothing of Mrs. Simpson, learned in one shocking moment that their king was planning to marry an American divorcee and might abdicate if prevented. The reaction was swift and brutal, and some supported the king's right to marry whom he chose, but most, shaped by traditional values and suspicious of American influence, condemned Wallis Simpson as a scheming adventuress who had seduced their king. She received death threats. Hate mail poured in. Crowds gathered outside locations where she was rumoured to be staying, shouting epithets. In France, Wallis hid in the villa of friends near Cannes. She begged Edward to reconsider. She offered to give him up entirely, but the king refused. Either he would have Wallis or he would abdicate. He had made his choice. December 10th, 1936. King Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication. 326 days after ascending the throne, he gave it up. For Wallis, for love, for obsession. The distinction had long since ceased to matter. On December 11th, at 10 in the evening, Edward, now simply His Royal Highness Prince Edward, addressed the nation by radio. His voice, carrying across the British Empire, spoke the words that would define both him and Wallis forever. You must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love, the woman I love. 3 words that would haunt Wallis Simpson for the remaining 50 years of her life. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The Duke of York, stammering and unprepared, became King George VI. Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, fled to Austria to wait out Wallis's divorce decree to become final. They could not marry until April, and he could not return to Britain. Wallis, in France, remained under siege, journalists camped outside, death threats arriving daily. The British establishment moved quickly to contain the damage. The new king and his advisors made clear that Wallis would never be welcome in Britain. She would never be received at court. She would never be styled Her Royal Highness, an omission that would enrage Edward for the rest of his life. She had caused the abdication. She would pay for it. Edward didn't see it that way. He had sacrificed everything for Wallis. She should be grateful. She should understand the magnitude of what he had given up. The fact that Wallis had never asked him to give up the throne, had in fact begged him not to, became irrelevant. Edward's narrative required him to be the romantic hero. Wallis must therefore be the prize worth any sacrifice. June 3rd. To 1937, Château de Condé, France. Edward and Wallis married in a private ceremony. No members of the royal family attended. The Church of England refused to allow a religious ceremony. A local mayor performed the civil service. 16 guests witnessed the marriage. Wallis wore a long blue dress designed by Mainbocher. She carried no flowers, only a prayer book. She was now the Duchess of Windsor. She would never be Her Royal Highness, that title explicitly denied by King George. The omission represented not just personal insult, but legal diminishment. Without the HRH, Wallis ranked below every royal duchess, every princess, every member of the extended royal family. She was married to a king's son, but ranked as little more than an ordinary aristocrat's wife. Edward was furious, and he spent years demanding the title for Wallis, writing endless letters to his brother the king, arguing, pleading, eventually threatening. The answer remained always the same: no. The woman who caused the abdication would receive no honours from the family she had harmed. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were now in permanent exile. They could not return to Britain without explicit invitation, which never came. They rented houses in France. They travelled. They attended parties. They existed in a strange limbo, too royal for ordinary society, too scandalous for royal society, welcomed nowhere with genuine warmth, tolerated everywhere with careful politeness. Wallis discovered what she had won: a husband who had given up everything for her and reminded her constantly of that sacrifice. No real home, only rented villas and hotel suites. She turned out to be a gilded cage that locked her in. She had climbed so high and fallen so far, and the landing had turned out to be a gilded cage that locked from the outside. The Duke became increasingly difficult, petulant, demanding. He required constant attention, constant reassurance, constant entertainment. Without the structure of royal duty, he had nothing to do and no idea how to fill his days. He drank more. He complained endlessly about the injustices done to him. He obsessed over the HRH denial, writing letter after letter, nursing his grievances. Wallis tried to build a life from the wreckage. She became known for her entertaining, her houses decorated with impeccable taste, her dinner parties legendary for their food and guest lists. But underneath the surface glamour, she was profoundly unhappy. She had never wanted to be queen. She had wanted security, position, respect. Instead, she had notoriety, exile, and a needy husband whose obsession with her was both the source of her position and the prison that trapped her. 1939. War came to Europe. The Duke and Duchess were in France when Germany invaded. They fled to Spain, then Portugal, causing the British government extreme anxiety. The Duke, bitter about his treatment, made indiscreet remarks about the war, about his brother, about Britain's chances. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, arranged an urgent solution. The Duke would become Governor of the Bahamas, a minor posting that would keep him far from Europe and German attention. August 1940. The Windsors arrived in Nassau. And after years of living in expensive hotels and borrowed villas, they now occupied Government House, a hot, uncomfortable building in a British backwater. For 5 years, they remained there. The Duke performed his duties with minimal enthusiasm. Wallis organised charity events and tried to pretend this was not punishment, disguised as appointment. The war ended. 1945. The Duke hoped for rehabilitation, for return to Britain, for forgiveness. None came. The new king, still George VI, still remembered his brother's desertion. The royal family had survived the abdication, survived the war, and wanted nothing to do with the man who had abandoned them. The Windsors returned to France. Permanent exile resumed. They rented a house in Paris, later buying a mansion in the Bois de Boulogne. And their lives settled into a pattern that would continue for 30 years. Winters in Paris, summers in the south of France, constant entertaining, fashion, parties, gossip, and underneath it all, desperate emptiness. Wallis threw herself into fashion and decorating. She became a style icon, her thin frame perfect for the designers she patronized. She appeared on best-dressed lists. She commissioned elaborate jewelry. She decorated and redecorated their various homes. But these were activities, not purpose, ways to fill time, not reasons to exist. The Duke declined slowly, without duty, without purpose. He faded. He drank more. He reminisced endlessly about his brief kingship. He maintained correspondence with people who remembered him as king, refusing to accept that he was now simply a former royal in comfortable exile. They would panic, call repeatedly, demand she would panic, call repeatedly, demand she return. Their marriage, never passionate, became a routine of mutual dependence. Edward needed Wallis to organize his life, to give him purpose through her activities and social connections. Wallis needed Edward's title and money to maintain her position. Neither was happy. Both were trapped. The 1950s and 60s passed in this fashion. The same parties, the same people, the same conversations. Wallis aged with the fierce determination of a woman who understood her value lay in her appearance. She maintained her weight at barely more than 100 pounds through constant dieting. She dressed impeccably. She had multiple facelifts, but she could not stop time. On May 28, 1972, the Duke of Windsor died in his Paris home. He was 77. Cancer had consumed him over several months. To the end, he had never returned to live in Britain, never reconciled fully with his family, never found peace with his choice. Wallis was 75. For 35 years, her identity had been the woman he gave up the throne for. Now he was gone, and she was simply the Duchess of Windsor, widow of an ex-king, living alone in a mansion in Paris. The British government arranged for the Duke's body to return to Britain. The funeral took place at Windsor. The royal family attended. They were polite to Wallis, nothing more. She stayed 2 nights at Buckingham Palace, the first and last time she would sleep in a British royal palace. Then she returned to Paris, back to exile. Back to the empty mansion. The final years were grim. Wallis suffered a series of small strokes. Her mind remained mostly intact, but her body failed. She stopped seeing people, embarrassed by her increasing frailty. She remained in her Paris home, cared for by staff, visited rarely by the few friends who remembered her. Rumours circulated about her lawyer, Maître Blum, who controlled her affairs and isolated her almost completely. Blum controlled access, controlled her finances, controlled the narrative. Whether this was protection or exploitation remained unclear. Wallis, increasingly confused and unwell, was unable to clarify. April the 24th, 1986. Wallis Warfield Spencer Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, died in her Paris home. She was 89. She had outlived Edward by 14 years. She had lived in exile for 49 years, longer than most people's entire lives. The British establishment arranged her funeral with careful precision. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. The royal family attended. They were respectful. She had, after all, been the Duke of Windsor's wife, and he had been a king's son. But the underlying message remained. She was permitted to be buried in British soil only because she was dead. For Wallis Simpson and those connected to her story, The abdication marked a permanent division of before and after. The Duke of Windsor never truly recovered from giving up the throne. His remaining 36 years were spent in comfortable exile. But comfort is not happiness. He died believing he had been unjustly treated, denied proper recognition for the woman he loved. And he never understood that by choosing Wallis over duty, he had broken the fundamental compact of monarchy. Kings do not get to choose personal happiness over institutional obligation. That is the price of the crown. Wallis herself faced a more complex aftermath. She had never wanted to cause a constitutional crisis. She had wanted security, position, a life of comfort and respect. Instead, she became the most hated woman in Britain, blamed for stealing a king, forcing an abdication, and weakening the monarchy at a critical moment before World War II. Her final 50 years were spent in wealthy exile, but exile nonetheless. She could not return to Britain without invitation. She was never received at court. She was never granted the HRH that Edward obsessed over. She was the Duchess of Windsor, but she was not truly part of the royal family. She existed in limbo, too royal for ordinary society, too scandalous for royal society. Beyond the personal tragedies, the abdication rippled through British society and the British Empire. It proved that even kings were subject to limits, that duty outweighed personal desire, that the monarchy survived through the subordination of individual will to institutional necessity. The abdication also revealed something about class, about gender, about the particular cruelties directed at women perceived as ambitious. Wallis was blamed far more than Edward. He was portrayed as a fool for love, foolish perhaps, but romantic. She was portrayed as a scheming adventuress who seduced a king for position. The fact that Edward's obsession was his own, and that Wallis had tried to end the relationship multiple times, that she had begged him not to abdicate, all this was ignored in favor of a narrative that made her the villain. The crisis forced constitutional changes. It clarified the relationship between Crown and Parliament. It established precedents about royal marriage that would affect future generations. When Princess Margaret wished to marry a divorced man in the 1950s, the abdication crisis was explicitly cited as reason to forbid it. When Prince Charles married the divorced Camilla Parker Bowles in 2005, the abdication crisis explained why she would be princess consort rather than queen. The story continues to fascinate because it touches universal themes. The conflict between love and duty, the price of ambition, and the question of whether any romance is worth destroying one's life. The tragedy of getting exactly what you thought you wanted, only to discover it was poison. Wallis Simpson wanted security. She got it, in the form of enough money to live comfortably for 50 years after Edward's death. She wanted position. She got it, becoming a duchess and one of the most famous women of the 20th century. She wanted to escape the poverty and dependence of her youth. She escaped completely, living in mansions with servants and wearing jewels worth millions. But she paid for it with 49 years of exile, with a needy, difficult husband whose obsession with her was both suffocating and the only thing that gave her legitimacy, with the hatred of an empire and the blame for a constitutional crisis she never wanted, with no children, no real home, and no true purpose beyond entertaining and maintaining appearances. 2025, 89 years after the abdication. At Frogmore, near Windsor Castle, two graves lie side by side. His Royal Highness Prince Edward, Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, and Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. The titles are carved in stone, but one crucial designation is missing. She is not Her Royal Highness. Even in death, the establishment made its point. Tourists visit occasionally, mostly American tourists, curious about the only American woman who brought down a British king. British visitors are fewer. The abdication remains, in Britain, a source of mild embarrassment, a constitutional crisis that strengthened the monarchy by forcing out its weakest member, but at tremendous immediate cost. The graves are simple, no grand monument, and just plaques marking the resting places of two people who caused one of the greatest upheavals in 20th century British history. In death, as in life, they lie outside the main royal burial sites, permitted proximity, but not full inclusion. Wallis Warfield Spencer Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, June 19th, 1896 to April the 24th, 1986, 89 years. 2 marriages before the infamous third. 49 years of exile after the abdication. A life spent climbing towards security and respect, achieving notoriety and isolation instead. A woman who inspired either loyalty or loathing, rarely anything between. A figure of history who changed the British monarchy without ever intending to, who wanted only the comfortable life other women of her class took for granted, yet who ended up with jewels and titles and profound loneliness, a legacy that still generates debate. Was she a gold digger who manipulated a weak king, or a woman trapped by forces beyond her control, blamed for a man's obsession? The truth, as always, is more complex than either simple narrative allows. Some crowns are too heavy to wear, some prices are too high to pay, and some love stories are not love stories at all, but obsessions that destroy everyone they touch.